This is how we end all wars. There is one and only one reason for the madness that the human being is manifesting. This is a big surprise to many, but if you stay with me, I will explain why it is so. But before doing so, I have to say that this fact, that there is ultimately only one reason for war, this fact means that any other attempt to unravel the madness and not at the same time addressing this soul cause at the root will simply just result in us perpetuating the madness. Furthermore, we have to acknowledge that those people who need the most to hear this message, they are those people who are most likely, they are those people who most likely don't even start watching this video. Or if they do, they are the ones that are quickest to drop out again. We also need to understand that the self-absorption and the self-centeredness of the human ego is very rigid. So we cannot wait for other people to change. We have to change. We have to live the change that we want to see in the world. This means that we have to be deeply committed to end any kind of conflict within ourselves. If we are not willing to do so, then we will continue to be a part of the problem. Okay, so what is this root cause? What is behind all the wars that I am talking about? It's ignorance. It's ignorance of our own true being. It is a failure to see the truth about oneself. Coming to see the truth about oneself is what all of my videos are about. So please go check them out afterwards. This video is about what the implications are as long as we live in ignorance about who we truly are. But mind you, there is no one to blame. This has nothing to do with feeling guilty. Do not feel guilty of anything. The reason for this will become clear to you as you watch this video. Okay. The human being is still in its infancy. And if you feel tempted to deny this, that would simply be an expression of this infancy. The vast majority of humanity lives in what could be described as a trance state. A trance state that veils the truth about what a human being truly is. And it is simply because it is so widespread that it perpetuates itself. From inside the trance state, it is impossible to recognize how entrenched oneself is. Also, everywhere the trance state is reconfirming itself. Awakening out of this trance state is what eventually will end all wars. And again, if you feel tempted to deny this, that would simply be an expression of this trance state. So let's talk about this trance state. The typical human being sees itself as a temporary individual existing separate from everything else. It looks into a mirror and it says, "This is me," and that is all that it sees. This idea about being separate from everything else gives rise to some unavoidable consequences. Being afraid of loneliness, being afraid of one's own insignificance, being afraid of getting old, being afraid of dying. All of this creates a mindset that is stored in the subconscious, and it is dictating automatic conditioned behavior. What I've just described is what we usually in spiritual terms are calling the human ego. And again, the human ego will deny it all rigorously. But as I said, this mindset will be stored in the subconscious, and it will be running the show, so to speak. In an effort to seek salvation from the eventual death, and in an effort to heal the trauma of its own perceived insignificance, the human ego is most of the time on a kind of crusade. It is a crusade where the ego seeks to impose its own will on the world. And there you have it. This is the sole reason for all the madness in the world. And if this mindset in the human being is not being addressed, anything else that you do will only be a detour, and it will ultimately just perpetuate the madness. What happens is that this seeing of oneself as being a temporary separate existence, that leads to the subconscious impression that leads to the subconscious impression that I am on my own. And from that impression, delusion, greed, hatred, and envy is born. The madness in the world is a direct result of this delusion, this greed, hatred, and envy. Well, okay. You might have the feeling that I am generalizing too much. Is what I'm saying really the case for almost everybody? Yes. But what confuses you is that the consequences of this ignorance are being manifested in many different ways. It sort of becomes a spectrum of behavior, ranging from the obvious dictator to the person being completely apathetic, from the one that is truly on a crusade to impose his or her own will upon the world. And even this is on a spectrum, ranging from the true war maker on a grand scale to the subtle war maker on the job site or in the family. On the other end of the spectrum, you will find a deep, apathetic person. It is the person that has sort of given up. It is the person that feels so depressed about this situation. But then you might argue that in between there is a huge part of the population that is just trying to get by, and that they do not create any madness. Well, yes and no. Why are they all not saying stop to the madness? Why are they not investing in addressing the problem directly? Why does a podcast like this one not get shared in the same way as all the drama? Well, there is a reason. The human being living in this trance state does not want to give up on any of the conveniences or privileges that it has for the sake of the whole. The human being does not want to give up on any of its conveniences or privileges that it has for the sake of the whole. It has a ton of excuses for not addressing the real problem. One of the main excuses being, those people over there, they do nothing, so why should I? It has everything to do with what's in it for me. And by that I mean, what's in it for me right now? And if there isn't a guaranteed, obvious reward of some kind right now, or at least in the very near future, the human being living in the trance state couldn't care less. So, in living like that, it becomes a direct contributor to the perpetuation of the madness. The only remedy for this madness is waking up out of the trance state. And by waking up, you will realize a whole new way of understanding existence and of understanding life and yourself. But actually waking up is not something that you choose to do. The impulse to awaken is not a personal impulse. It is an evolutionary impulse. The only question is, do you respond to the impulse? Or do you desperately cling to the trance state? So what does it mean to awaken? What happens when you awaken? Well, you realize very clearly that all the ideas you had about existence, about life, and about yourself are just that. Ideas, convictions. And this realization opens you up to recognize your human beings existing, to recognize your human beings' existence as a completely integrated part of everything, of the whole. Picture it like this. An animal does not recognize itself in a mirror, where the human being in the trance state, when it looks into the mirror, it recognizes itself as this temporary separate individual. In contrast to this, the awake human being recognizes itself as everything and everywhere. I know, this does not make any sense to the human being living in the trance state. Just as the animal does not know what it means to recognize itself seeing into a mirror, the unawake human being has no clue to what it means to see oneself as everything and everywhere. Furthermore, it cannot be described to the unawake human being because it will simply not make any sense to the less evolved mind. I know what I just said is typically frustrating, and it could also make the unawake mind angry, but that's just how it is. As I said earlier, the unawake human being sees itself as a separate, temporary, individual existence. Also, as mentioned before, this worldview gives rise to some unavoidable consequences. For instance, feeling isolated and feeling insignificant. This in turn ends up being what motivates the unawake human being. And the result is anything from conflicts in the family to full-blown wars. There is no ending to war as long as the human being is living in this trance state. There is no ending to war as long as the human being is living in this trance state. War is a direct result of the human being trying to escape its own feeling of insignificance. War is a direct result of the human being trying to escape its own feeling of insignificance. It is the feeling of being a fragment, the feeling of being isolated, the feeling of being separate, the feeling of being lonely, the feeling of being insignificant. It is all of that fuels it all. all of these feelings, combined with different personality structures, is what is creating anything from the dictator on the grand scale to the dictator on the job site, or the dictator at home. And it also creates the ones that just simply do not want to risk anything by speaking out loud. This podcast was actually motivated by a comment that I got on one of my older videos. The comment goes like this. You talk about war and not watching the news. For me, this is my problem. I saw what happened to over 1,200 men, women and babies on October 7th. These are my relatives. I am old enough to remember people, when I was young, who had numbers on their arms from the Nazi death camps, some even from Denmark. Unless I can believe that it is all an illusion, how can I not feel anger and total sorrow? My heart burns with sadness. I feel your pain. But what happened was a result of thousands of years of ignorance on both sides. Trying to eliminate ignorance by war is ignorance. Who are your relatives? Who are your relatives? So I want to show you something. This is you. And you have two parents. And your parents, they have each two parents. That makes it 4 grandparents. Then your 4 grandparents, they have each 2 parents. So when we take the next step back, there are 8 grandparents. Each of your grandparents, they have 2 parents. And so it goes on, back into time. So now I ask you, if we go back, say, 2,000 years, we go back to year 0. How many ancestors do you think that you have? Well, let's do the math. For every generation, the amount of ancestors doubles. How many generations have gone by since year 0? Well, on an average, there is between 20 and 30 years between each generations. So let's say that we got 25 years between each generations. That means that in a time span of 2,000 years, there are approximately 80 generations. So when we know that, and then we double the amount of ancestors for each generation, and we do that 80 times, what kind of number do you think that we come up with? Well, it is a incredible huge number. And I almost do not know how to express this number. But as I understand, it is actually called 1 quintillion, 208 quadrillion, 925 trillion, 819 billion, 614 million, 629,000, 706,176. It is a mind-boggling number. And you might think that this is just theory, but no. This is an actuality. There is nothing wrong with the math. If we then estimate the population on the Earth at year 0, most estimates says that at year 0 there were 300 million people living. Then how is that possible? Even if we by today's standards say that there is living 8.1 billion people on planet Earth, that is still a much, much, much smaller amount than the amount of ancestors that the math shows that you have if you go back 2,000 years. So what is going on here? Well, we have to take into account that there is a phenomenon called pedigree collapse. And that means that over many generations, it is inevitable that distant relatives, they were married, meaning the same person may appear multiple times in this family tree. And this reduces the actual number of unique ancestors. But that is not really my point. My point is that this number is so incredible, huge, that the amount of ancestors you got seems to be vastly larger than the entire population at year 0. My question to you is, where does that leave space for my unique lineage of ancestors, independent of your ancestors? There simply are no space for a unique lineage separated from everybody else. The math is so crystal clear that we are indeed all related. Then the mind says, well, yes, but I draw a line some 3 or 4 or 5 generations back. But if you do that, you are simply just fooling yourself. The math is crystal clear. There are no unique, separated lineage of ancestors. We are all related. And we have to wake up to this fact. For as long as we do not do that, we will keep on viewing other people as strangers. There are no such thing as your ancestors separated from everybody else. That is the delusion. So there are not somebody else who needs to wake up. You have to wake up. We have to wake up. That is the only remedy. Do not wait for somebody else to wake up. You are the human race. There are no different races of humanity. We are all one. If you have stayed with me this far in this video, I salute you. I thank you. Would you please do me this favor? Please have the courage to share this video. To share this video with friends, with families, with anybody. No, I do certainly not care about being popular. That is absolutely not the point. But sometimes my heart cries when I see the kind of exposure the madness gains. How are we to change if the madness always gets to be the most exposed? We are changing the world by changing ourselves. And the only real way we can change ourselves is by waking up. Thank you for listening, my friend.